I stood in a moonlit clearing with my hands shaking so hard I could hear my jacket sleeves brush together, and a thing taller than my porch roof stood 30 feet away, still as an old cedar, watching me cry like I had been waiting 10 months for permission. I remember saying thank you out loud to something that never spoke, and I remember feeling no fear at all, only this heavy, quiet relief I had not felt since before my wife died. But to understand how I got there, I need to go back to the week before when I drove up to the cabin for what I told myself would be my last season. My name is Clint Sutton. I was 58 that fall, and I had buried my wife June in March after 32 years of marriage. So by November, I had turned into the kind of man who could answer every practical question and still could not decide what to do with a quiet room. I had worked line maintenance for the county electric co-op most of my life, which meant I trusted tools, weather reports, and what could be measured with a tape. I had no use for stories that asked for belief without evidence. But evidence stopped helping me where grief was concerned. Therefore, I loaded my truck with canned food, a splitting maul, my 30-30, and ranger's bed, and I drove to the family cabin outside Elk Run because I did not know where else to put myself. The place sat at the edge of mixed pine and alder with a creek folding around the north slope, and June had always called it our reset button when work or life went crooked. She planted foxglove near the porch and insisted the paint color stay a little faded because she liked things that looked lived in. After she got sick, we came less, but she still made me promise to keep the roof patched and the wood stove clean. I kept both promises, but I had decided that season would be the last one, because every board in that place carried her voice, and I was tired of hearing it when there was no answer to give. I told my son, Luke, I was heading up for 3 weeks and probably putting the property on the market after Christmas. He got quiet in that way people do when they want to argue but do not have the energy, and he said, "Do what you gotta do, Dad," before he hung up. We had been rough with each other the last year of June's illness, both of us scared, both of us stubborn, and neither one willing to admit fear in plain words. We had not seen each other in 4 months by then, but I did what I always did when something hurt. Therefore, I reached for a task, checked tire pressure, checked fuel cans, checked rifle oil, and kept moving. The first 2 days followed a rhythm I understood. I woke before sunrise, fed Ranger, drank coffee on the porch while fog lifted off the lower meadow, and walked fence line where elk sometimes pushed through. I cleaned gutters, replaced a cracked pane in the mudroom, and split enough kindling for a week. Ranger stayed close, old but sturdy, black coat silvering at the muzzle, and he would lie by the steps and watch the tree line the way he watched a doorway when he expected company. I noticed it, but I filed it under dog business and kept working. On the 3rd morning, I came out with my gloves and found a neat stack of dry cedar rounds against the porch rail, cut to stove length, bark brushed clean like somebody cared how they looked. I stood there with my mug in my hand and tried to remember if I had hauled them up from the lower shed the day before, but I had not, because I had spent all afternoon fixing latch hardware and Ranger never left my side. I looked for tire tracks, boot marks, anything, but the frost around that stack stayed mostly unbroken except for one wide, shallow depression near the rail that did not match any tread I knew. I called Earl Pritchard on the old landline because cell signal was patchy, and he answered on the 2nd ring with that gravelly voice of his that always sounded like he had just walked uphill. Earl owned the ridge west of mine, 80 acres of timber and old pasture, and he had lived up there long enough to remember everybody's parents by first name. I asked if he had stopped by, and he said, "Not since Tuesday, Clint. Why?" I told him about the wood, and he went quiet for a beat before he said, "If it bothers you, keep your lights on early. If it doesn't bother you, leave a little respect out there." But he would not explain what he meant. Therefore, I hung up annoyed at him, and more annoyed at myself for feeling uneasy over a pile of firewood. That afternoon I hiked down to the creek bend where deer crossed, and Ranger froze near a patch of willow, nose high, tail level, no hackles up. He gave one soft woof and looked back at me like he did when June used to call us in from the garden. I scanned the slope and saw nothing but shadow and trunks. But the birds had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath for no bad reason I could name. I found an old wire snare at the edge of the trail. One I had not set because I never trapped that side, and it had been unlooped and coiled neatly around a branch at shoulder height. I told myself there were simple explanations. A hunter cleaning up old gear, a neighbor playing a joke, my own memory slipping from too little sleep. I even said it out loud while Ranger watched me with that patient look dogs get when humans are pretending to be smart. "You're not helping," I told him, and he yawned in my face like he had heard worse. I measured the broad depression by the porch against my boot that night, and I did it 3 times because I wanted to be able to call myself foolish with confidence. My boot was size 11. The mark looked close to twice that and wrong in shape. By day 5, the signs kept coming, but they stayed gentle. A line of river stones appeared on the porch rail, 5 of them, each one smooth and wet, arranged from largest to smallest. Ranger took one sniff and lay down beside them as if they belonged there. At dawn, I found a deadfall limb moved off the trail to the spring, dragged clear in one clean sweep that would have taken me half an hour with a saw. Near the spring, I found tracks that were not tracks so much as full impressions in soft mud, long and wide with a heel deeper than the forefoot, spaced farther apart than any man I knew could comfortably stride on wet ground. I went into town for fuel and groceries, mostly to hear human voices, and reset my head. Elk Run had one diner and a hardware store with more gossip than nails, and I sat at the counter while Connie poured coffee without asking, because she had known June since high school. She looked at me and said, "You sleeping at all?" I said, "Enough," which was a lie too small to argue with. Earl came in 10 minutes later, nodded once at me and sat down 2 stools away. We talked weather and elk movement and road washouts, but when I mentioned the stacked stones, he said, "You can laugh if you need to, Clint, but there's old things up here that mind their own business if you mind yours." I did laugh, because that was easier than admitting I was listening. I told him I was too old for ghost stories, and he said he had not mentioned ghosts. He stirred his coffee and added, "My granddad called him the timber watchman, said he sees folks when they can't see themselves." I asked if he believed that, and he shrugged. I believe what my dogs believe. They never barked at him. That line stayed with me all the way back up the ridge because Ranger had not barked once either, not even when he stared into trees like he saw a person standing there. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs and June's old thermos beside me, watching light drain out of the meadow in layers of amber and grey. Wind moved through pine needles high above and carried that cold mineral smell you get right before the first hard freeze. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, and his tail thumped once against the deckboards. I followed his eyes to the edge of the meadow and caught movement between 2 spruce trunks, high and dark and smooth, gone before my brain could sort size from distance. I stood without meaning to, heart pounding, but there was no crashing, no run, only stillness settling back over everything. I slept badly, therefore I woke before 4 and built a fire just to have something alive in the stove. At first light, I walked to where I had seen the motion, and I found a patch of flattened grass and one broken branch at about 8 feet high with the fibers fresh and wet. There were no claw marks, no gouges, no signs of struggle. Just weight, careful and controlled. I stood there with my hand on that brake and had a very practical thought, which was that if this was a person, he was huge, and if this was an animal, it was paying attention to me in a way animals usually did not. Around noon, the sky turned that metallic white that means weather is changing. But I still went to the memorial ridge above the creek where I had scattered part of June's ashes in spring. I had set a small cedar bench there, nothing fancy, just a place to sit where she used to watch hawks ride thermals. I carried a thermos and a wool blanket and stayed until my hands went numb. I talked to her the way I had since the funeral, half practical updates, half apologies that arrived too late, but my chest stayed locked and dry no matter what I said. "I'm trying," I told that empty air, and I meant it, but trying felt like lifting a truck with bare hands. On my way back, I noticed fresh prints in the mud beside my own from earlier that morning, and they matched the porch depression in shape and size. They also ran parallel to my path for 50 yards without crossing into it, which made me feel watched without feeling hunted. I know how strange that sounds, but that was the truth of it. Something was near me, something big enough to break saplings by accident, but it moved like it was trying not to startle me. I have told this story twice before, once to my son and once to my pastor, and both times I stumbled right there because I still do not have a better word than careful. The weather report that night called for sleet turning to wet snow with wind gusts near 40 up on exposed ridges, and Earl left a message saying not to chance the North Trail if it iced over. I planned to stay put, but grief is stubborn, and weather can sound easier than memory. Therefore, I convinced myself I should check the upper fence before the storm hit hard. Ranger whined when I reached for my coat, which he never did, and he planted himself in front of the mudroom door until I pushed gently past him. "I'll be an hour," I said, and even while I said it, I felt a pull in my gut that told me to sit down instead. The first mile was fine. Cold rain stinging sideways, but trail still visible. Therefore, I kept moving faster than I should have on slick leaves. Near the split rock overlook, my right foot slid on moss, and I went down hard on my left knee, sliding 6 feet into brush and banging my shoulder against a stump. I did not break anything, but pain hit hot and sudden, and the wind knocked me stupid for a minute. Ranger circled back, whining, licking my face like I was a pup. I got up slow, tested weight, and could walk, but not well. That was when sleet started, tiny hard pellets ticking on my hood and turning the ground glossy in minutes. I should have turned downhill immediately, but I cut across toward the memorial ridge because in my head it looked shorter. The storm thickened faster than forecast. Visibility dropped, and every landmark looked like every other landmark once snow began sticking to branches. I kept telling myself I knew this property blindfolded, but confidence was a poor map once the creek noise shifted with wind and I could not tell east from north. Ranger ranged ahead and doubled back, restless and urgent. But I kept choosing wrong forks because my knee hurt and my temper hurt worse. I reached the bench at full dusk instead of home by dark, and that shook me because I had not meant to come there at all. The cedar seat was slick with ice, and June's little wind chime, the one Luke had hung in spring, clinked in sharp, uneven bursts. I sat hard, breathing shallow, and I felt that old pressure rise from my stomach to my throat. Grief and fear braided together so tight I could not separate them. In my head, the words started running without order. I told myself this could not be real. This storm, this getting lost on my own ridge, this feeling watched by something too big for reason. I wanted to run, but my knee would not let me, and still some quiet part of me kept saying, "Stay still. You are not in danger. Wait and listen." Ranger stopped whining and stood facing the trees downhill, tail wagging once, slow. I looked up and saw it, fully this time, a shape stepping out from behind a fir at maybe 40 yards. Dark fur wet with sleet, shoulders broad enough to hide half the trunk, head slightly tilted as if it was checking whether I could see clearly. It did not crouch, it did not rush, it did not make itself big in threat because it already was big beyond anything I could explain. It simply stood there with its hands low and open, weight balanced, eyes fixed on me with a calm that made my panic feel loud and childish by comparison. I did a thing that still makes me laugh at myself when I am honest. I raised one hand like I was crossing in front of a stranger in the grocery aisle and said, "Excuse me," before I added, "I think I'm turned around." Ranger sat down beside me like this was a normal Tuesday. I expected nothing, but the creature shifted one step to its right and looked down the slope, then back at me, then right again. It repeated that motion twice, patient as a man guiding a nervous horse into a trailer. My brain fought it, but my body understood. I stood and took 2 limping steps downhill where it had indicated. The creature moved parallel through the trees, keeping distance, never crossing directly in front of me, but always visible when I started doubting the path. If I veered left toward a steep draw, it stopped and faced me until I corrected right. If I paused to breathe, it paused too. The snow thickened, but I could make out the long line of its back and the pale glint of sleet on fur between trunks, and that became my marker better than trailblazers I could barely see. We moved like that for what felt like an hour and was probably 20 minutes. 1 old man, 1 old dog, and 1 impossible guide walking the same ridge in silence. Near the lower meadow, wind gusted hard enough to tear June's patchwork quilt from the porch line where I had left it airing that morning. It sailed off the rail and snagged in blackberry canes 10 feet out, and I cursed because that quilt was the last thing she stitched during chemo, crooked squares and all. I stepped toward it, but my knee buckled and I grabbed the post to keep from falling. The creature stopped at the edge of the yard, watched me, and I felt that same held breath in the woods. Then it crossed 2 strides to the canes, knelt with care that looked almost delicate in hands that size, freed the quilt without tearing a seam, and folded it twice before setting it on the porch rail where the stones had been. I did not hold together after that. I sat on the top step with snow melting off my hat and cried in a way I had not cried at the funeral, not from fear, but from being seen while I was failing, and helped without being judged for it. The creature stood at the edge of lantern light, chest rising slow, head lowered slightly as if giving me privacy while still making sure I was all right. I said June's name out loud and told her I was sorry for trying to outrun her memory. I told that silent figure thank you, and my voice cracked right through the middle. Ranger leaned against my leg and sighed like he had been waiting months for me to stop pretending. The creature took 1 step back, paused and turned toward the trees. Before it disappeared, it looked over its shoulder once, and in that glance there was no request, no demand, no claim, only acknowledgement. I stayed on that step until my hands stopped shaking. When I finally stood, I took June's quilt inside, dried Ranger by the stove, and put 3 apples on the porch rail before bed, because I did not know what else respect looked like. In the morning, the apples were gone, and in their place sat a bundle of dry birch bark tied with grass, enough to start a fire in wet weather. The next days settled into a different kind of quiet. I still did chores, still checked fence and roof and springboks, but I stopped pushing through pain just to prove I could. If I found stones lined on the rail, I lined them back. If birch bark appeared, I left apples or carrots from town. Ranger sometimes looked toward the north tree line and wagged in that slow, respectful way, and once at dawn, I saw the creature standing in mist beyond the meadow, half visible, still as ever, before it faded back into timber. There was never a rush toward me, never a display, never any act that read as ownership. It felt more like neighboring, the old kind where nobody talks much, but people watch out for each other through winter. I finally called Luke on a Wednesday evening while venison chili simmered on the stove and sleet ticked the window glass. He answered cautious, and I said, "I need to tell you something strange, and I need you to listen before you decide I've lost my mind." He was quiet for a second, therefore I kept going. I told him about the wood stacks, the tracks, the storm, the quilt. I expected a hard silence, but he said, "Dad, after Mum died, you stopped sounding like yourself. Right now you sound like yourself." I leaned on the counter and shut my eyes because that landed deeper than I was ready for. Luke came up that weekend with his boy, my grandson Eli, and the three of us walked the lower meadow in clear, cold sun. I did not show off or go hunting for proof. I showed him the branch break, the broad impressions near the spring where rain had softened edges, and the porch rail where stones still appeared some mornings in odd little patterns. Eli asked if a giant lived in the woods, and Luke looked at me before saying, "Maybe something does." That was enough. We fixed the chicken coop latch, split wood, and ate lunch on the porch where June used to sit, and for the first time in a long while, there was no strains sitting between my son and me like a third person. That night, Luke and I stayed up by the stove after Eli fell asleep in the loft. We spoke plain, no speeches, because men in my family were not trained for speeches. He said, "I was angry at you for shutting me out when Mom got bad." I said, "I was angry at myself and handed it to you because that was easier." He rubbed his eyes and nodded. "I miss her every day." I said, "Me too, every hour some days." We sat in that truth for a while, therefore, when he reached over and squeezed my shoulder, I did not pull away. I never told the whole town. I knew how that would go, and I had no appetite for becoming a story people used to entertain themselves over pie. I told Earl because he had earned it, and he listened without interrupting while we checked fence on his west line. When I finished, he said, "Sounds like you were looked after." I said, "That's exactly what it felt like." He nodded toward the timber and replied, "Some things around here have longer memories than we do." We left it there. I have stopped needing everyone to agree with what happened before I can trust what it did to me. By late December, the sale papers I had asked a realtor to draft were sitting unsigned on my kitchen table in town. I stared at them for 3 days, but every time I imagined strangers stripping that porch paint and flattening June's garden bed, my chest tightened in a different way than grief. It felt like abandoning a place that had held me up when I was close to folding. Therefore, I called and cancelled the listing. I kept the cabin not as a shrine, but as a working piece of my life I still belonged to. I started coming up 1 week each month, fixing what needed fixing, walking slow, leaving offerings sometimes, receiving nothing I could put in a museum and everything I needed anyway. Spring came late the next year, with creekbanks swollen and Trillium pushing through leaf litter. Ranger's hips got worse, so I built him a low ramp to the porch and carried him when the mud got deep. One evening he stood at the meadow edge, ears forward, tail doing that slow metronome wag, and I saw movement at the tree line, broad and dark among new leaves. The creature stayed partly hidden, watching us with those steady amber-brown eyes. Therefore I set my hand on Ranger's back and said, "He's slowing down." The figure dipped its head once, a small motion, and slipped away uphill. Ranger slept hard that night, nose tucked under his paw, peaceful. When Ranger died in July, I buried him on the rise behind the cabin where he could keep an eye on things, as June used to say. Luke and Eli came for the day, and Eli placed Ranger's worn tennis ball beside the grave. After they left, I sat there through dusk, listening to crickets and creek water. And at some point, I noticed 3 smooth stones placed in a line at the base of the pine. Stones that had not been there when we finished. I picked one up, warm from the day, and cried quietly, but cleanly. No choke in it, no panic, only missing and gratitude mixed together. People ask me what I think it was, and I tell them the honest thing, which is that I do not know in the scientific sense, and probably never will. I know what I saw in sleet and moonlight. I know what lifted branches off my trail and brought dry bark after storms, and folded June's quilt without tearing a stitch. I know my dog trusted it before I did, and my dog had better instincts than most men I have worked beside. I also know I went to that ridge planning to end a chapter of my life, because I could not stand the weight of memory, but I walked out of that season carrying memory differently, less like a stone I dragged, and more like a hand on my shoulder. I still have habits from before. I still check locks, still carry a flashlight, still prefer facts over stories when facts are available. But grief stopped being an enemy to defeat after that winter. It became weather, sometimes rough, sometimes gentle, always moving, and I learned I could stand in it without disappearing. Luke and I talk every Sunday now, short calls mostly, but steady. Eli comes up for 2 weekends each summer and insists we leave apples on the porch rail for the watchman, and I let him because children do not always need correction when they are showing respect. I have thought about that night on the ridge more times than I can count, especially the moment where panic almost took over and something outside language held me in place long enough to choose trust. There is a kind of mercy in being met where you are weakest and not being asked to explain yourself first. That is what changed me. I stopped measuring every mystery by whether I could own it, and I started asking whether I could live better because of it. This place gave me that question back when I had gone numb. Therefore, I stay open to what I cannot name and careful with what I can. I opened this by telling you about standing in that moonlit clearing with tears on my face and no fear in my chest. And that was true in every detail. But the part that matters now is simpler. I came up to the cabin as a widower, trying to close the door on a life that hurt too much to revisit. But I left that season with the door open and the light on. I still do not know what stood with me in the snow, and I have stopped needing to. If you have ever had one quiet moment that changed how you carry your hurt, the next story on your screen is where I would go after this.